I'm going to be talking about some things that have already been mentioned, some sort of recent developments around targeting, if you like, or intervening in the lives of children in the UK. And what I essentially mean by, my paper is called The Militarisation of Childhood in the UK, Some Recent Trends, and what I essentially mean, I think, by the militarisation of childhood, which is a very broad term, is something about the reconfiguration of ideas of childhood and childhood experiences that lend themselves to the idea of a more productive, useful citizen in the making through kind of practices that we associate with the military. So I'm interested in how childhood has come to be thought about as a site where military intervention can be a very positive force for children themselves. And I want to think about the stakes for children, but also the stakes for wider society through some of those developments. So in recent years, this government in particular, but the government before it as well, have promoted and put considerable resources into various initiatives as part of its agenda to entrench something that we've heard about briefly already called the military ethos into British children's lives. Now, among those various initiatives are things like the current government's aim to create 100 new cadet units in state-funded schools by 2015, to increase the use of veterans in alternative provision for these underperforming, as it were, pupils in schools, to fast-track veterans, including those without degrees, through teacher training, with a paid salary and things like that, through something called Troops to Teachers, which I'll come back to, and an ongoing pilot scheme to tie the National Citizen Service Scheme more directly to military training and military activities. And in wider society, we've also seen kind of echoes of the military ethos around children and childhood in things like these periodic calls and moral panics around, that we get in the media, but also radio phone-ins, around military national service being a panacea for youth gun and knife crime, that wayward youth just need a bit of discipline, and the institution to provide that is the military. Now, broadly, this idea of the military ethos, as the government call it, refers to the idea that certain values and qualities are inherent somehow to the military and to military personnel and veterans as a direct result of their military socialisation and service. The military is often, in this vein, characterised as a disciplined organisation where values like loyalty, hard work, courage, self-sacrifice, commitment, and so on are routinely performed and entrenched and promoted. And there is very much, I think, an assumption here that military personnel who fight and sometimes die have higher values and standards than civilians necessarily do because they don't routinely face such risks. Now, although these arguments have been made for a very long time and they've been politically wielded by the UK armed forces and other militaries for all sorts of things, not least the exclusion of sexual and ethnic minorities from the armed forces for a considerable period, and for the exclusion or marginalisation of women in the armed forces, this idea that the military shouldn't respond to wider democratisation and social change because it's unique and it has its own set of values. This kind of linking of that notion to the lives and life chances of children, and the idea that those lives and life chances will be enhanced through greater exposure to military ethos, and that therefore the government but also society should support that, I think are a more kind of recent development. I'm not saying children have never been caught up in these practices, they have, but it's quite interesting the current configuration of those things and the sort of questions that we maybe ought to ask about this. And I think one of the questions is, well, what is childhood? And why would we want such values to be transmitted to children in any case? And are the military or militarised kind of activities the best way to transmit these values to children anyway? So there's assumptions that children are perhaps wayward, but also that they need certain things and certain qualities in order to be part of our political and social community. And I want to suggest that this is not only important, although it is very important because of the potential impact on children and their families, their friends, their schools and so forth, but this should be a key concern because of the potential impact on wider communities and indeed British society as a whole, if you like, in a much wider sense. And I think these developments are an important indicator of the resurgence of kind of a particular type of, going back to Brian's point about militarisms, perhaps a particular type of kind of militaristic values in the UK being reproduced and in everyday settings. Now, the first way in which I think this idea of the military ethos contributes to militarism is through the ways that practices associated with it all seek to build popular support for the military, something we've heard quite a bit about already today. And I think this is happening in a very particular context of global recession and international political economy, as Brian put it. So I think the need to build popular support for the military in a period of global recession and the role of British children in this should not be underestimated. So, for example, the Royal British Legion has found, in a fairly recent study back in 2006, a while ago, but it found that unemployment among 18 to 49-year-old British veterans, so quite a vast swathe of them, is often around twice that of the national average. And one of the ways that the government are exploring employment opportunities for troops post-deployment is through Troops to Teachers. Now, the original Troops to Teachers programme originated in the United States, where it was essentially set up by the Clinton administration to provide veterans of the First Gulf War with employment. And it's unlikely to be a coincidence that here the launch of Troops to Teachers has coincided with similar unemployment issues among veterans, plus military redundancies, both of which are affecting in particular those who served in Afghanistan, who have this very high visible profile that we've been hearing about. So as such, I think things like Troops to Teachers serve an important political function for a government that's under pressure to be seen to be doing something for veterans. It allows the government to be seen to be doing something, but something that does very little actually to address wider issues of unemployment and disadvantage among veterans, but indeed the wider population and things it could be doing to promote wider economic and political reforms for job growth for all. It's a kind of, quick stop measure. And I do wonder as well, given the history of implanting US initiatives quite poorly often into this country, how long it might be before we see something along the lines of a No Child Left Behind type approach, which is an act in the US, part of which involves high schools, secondary schools in the United States being compelled by that law to give information, names, addresses and phone numbers of their pupils to the military unless specific opt-out is obtained. So, and a lot of the time, of course, schools are busy, there are bureaucratic problems, they forget to do that and they just pass the information on. So how long might it be before we get a no Child Left Behind type approach here, given some of the things we've heard already about recruitment and recruitment deficits? And indeed, I think perhaps another example of why children are an important target for the military ethos is this need to think longer term about who might serve in the future British military. So recently released Ministry of Defence plans that we've heard about reveal that the military is being restructured, though the idea of modernising is kind of all over this stuff. Cutting costs is still is clearly a concern as well. Part of the restructuring will include redundancies for regular personnel, greater reliance on reservists, including volunteers who work in civilian jobs most of the time, but may well be called upon to fight. Now, normalising the role of the military among children, particularly through getting them to engage in military activities as cadets or those in alternative provision, may be a good way to recruit the regulars and reservists of the future. And I don't think we should over-egg that, but I also think we can't ignore it either. Indeed, also when we look more closely at who's being most targeted by the government's military ethos initiatives, there are some troubling links between these initiatives and potential recruitment activities. So both Troops for Teachers and alternative provision schemes have been described by their supporters as providing young people, often from some of the most disadvantaged backgrounds, discipline, self-respect and a sense of purpose. So it's particular kids that are being kind of targeted. It's state schools that are being earmarked for cadet force expansion. Now, although there are some evaluations that are quite positive and say, well, alternative provision that's provided by veterans and cadet membership can actually help young people, it can have a positive impact on their school attendance, their behaviour and so on. There's lots of dark sides to this, but one of them is that those in alternative provision typically drop formal qualifications like GCSEs to go off running in the woods, learning first aid, and those kinds of things. Skill sets that basically are very, very useful, coincidentally, to the military. Now, given that those skills may come at the cost of traditional qualifications and make these kids very kind of good at skills that the military enhance, the problem here is if you don't have any qualifications and you end up going into the military, you end up in often the most hazardous roles. And this military two-tier system where, you know, if you want to be an officer, you have to have qualifications. If you don't have them, you go into the lowest ranks and often the most dangerous jobs. That actually means that we not only are reproducing that, but we're making sure that pre-military socioeconomic inequalities are entrenched and reproduced through that once again. There's also an overriding emphasis on military men providing wayward boys with much needed behavioural correction through these military ethos schemes, which once again I think normalises the idea of men as society's protectors and reinforces the notion that boisterous young men simply need an outlet for their aggression, which is problematic for both men and women. All of this conceals the great social harms that paramilitary training and socialisation have shown to cause to individuals and communities, from enhanced rates of drug and alcohol abuse and PTSD to high rates of interpersonal violence and violent criminality amongst veterans, which is much higher than in the civilian population. The notion in particular, sorry, I'm getting there, that kids involved in gangs would be cured of their social ills by swapping their disorganised street violence for organised military violence seems a highly disingenuous one to me as well. This idea that, you know, you take kids, I've written a piece called Kids with Guns because it struck me that Gorillaz song was a good title. The idea that you take kids with guns who are on the street and put them in the army and give them guns and that somehow sorts them out. I can't really get my head around that. Finally, I think military ethos initiatives are all everyday practices that rely on the idea that the military is, and perhaps this is one of the key points, a core, inevitable, and indeed socially valuable institution in our society, so much so that it should have a key role in the lives of British children. So though non-military youth groups also claim to successfully promote things like cooperation and social responsibility, it's not them, but cadet forces and their military ethos that are attracting large-scale government support and resources. Though a number of non-graduates may, in the wider sort of society may potentially be excellent teachers, they're not being fast-tracked through teacher training. Though all manner of people in our society believe in hard work, loyalty, courage, self-commitment, sacrifice, you know, NHS workers, dare I say teachers, believe in these things, it's only veterans and military personnel and organisations that are being heralded as the solution to society's supposed ills and to these problems of childhood, which I'm not even sure exist. Military ethos initiatives aimed at children will also, I think, make it much harder to promote non-military ways of being and doing unless they're resisted. One other thing to consider in this vein is whether soldiers who, whilst very capable of free thought and emotional intelligence, and so on, there's still people who have been taught to conform and be obedient within certain structures. Are they best placed to educate children? What happens to democratic oversight if children are not only subjected to Michael Gove's learning by rote curriculum, but also have it delivered by those trained only to question within certain confines? Okay, that's right. The great risk of all this, I think, and this is my final point, is that as the military becomes more normalised in our society through the targeting of children, so too does military violence as a commonsensical approach to global issues. So these everyday practices have a resonance on the international scale. British children are therefore one especially important section of the population who have become the target of practices that reproduce the UK as a warfare state. Thank you.